to have people from downstate be interested in the Western Upper Peninsula. And thanks for the kind introduction. And so I know, as JJ had told me, and he just mentioned that some of you had been involved in the One Book, One Community program and read Women of the Copper Country. So some of you have some familiarity with the period surrounding the 1913-14 strike and some of the towering figures of our regional history. But whether you participated in the program or not, I hope tonight to open the door to more stories about the Keweenaw Peninsula, and also offer you some opportunities to explore heritage projects up here in the Western UP. And I'm thrilled also to see some friends in the audience who have their own really important perspectives on this location. So I'm really excited to have some question and answer towards the end. So let me share my slides. Okay, hope everybody can see that. Okay, so I'm going to, I guess, move ahead one slide. So I'm gonna, no, I'm gonna go back one slide, sorry. I'm gonna start off with some stories from my recent book, which has the same title as the talk tonight, Company, Suburbs, Architecture, Power, and the Transformation of Michigan's Mining Frontier, which was published last fall by the University of Tennessee Press. And then I'll tell you about a digital online resource that I've been creating with colleagues and students here at Michigan Technological University that would let you all see historic maps and data online. It's called the Keweenaw Time Traveler. I'll have just a moment at the end to introduce you to that as a way to keep learning about this region and its history. So first, let's get oriented. I often call the Keweenaw Peninsula the UP's UP, sticking out into Lake Superior. The geology of the Keweenaw and Isle Royal, the island to its northwest that's now a national park, features some of the purest copper deposits in the world, which have been valued and worked by Ojibwe people and their ancestors starting more than 7,000 years ago. And copper artifacts have been excavated all along the Mississippi River, indicating the important role of Keweenaw copper in the vast trade network operated by Indigenous Americans. Europeans, the French, and then the English knew about Keweenaw copper, but never invested the capital needed to extract it profitably. And when the new United States appropriated the land from the Ojibwe in a series of treaties starting in the 1840s, they commodified the land and its resources. They established a mining region, kicking off one of the nation's earliest mining booms, even before the California gold rush. The port towns of Copper Harbor, and Eagle River hosted early prospectors who came by water. And once the first mine turned a profit, Cliff Mine, around 1849, more and more experts realized the richest deposits were down the peninsula near Calumet and along the Portage Lake, which bisects the peninsula and offered a useful transportation route, once fully dredged and channelized by the 1870s. At the height of the region's population around 1920, the largest copper mining companies were the Calumet and Hecla, by far the largest and the richest, the Quincy Mining Company, which paid out so consistently that its investors called it Old Reliable, and the Copper Range, the youngest of the three, but still enormously profitable for investors in Boston, New York, and other eastern cities. Those big companies had largely consolidated the hundreds of smaller companies that had pocked the landscape, including the Sheldon Columbian Mining Company that we hear about some tonight. Most people who think about the mining history of the copper country know about the amazingly diverse immigrant population, with people coming from Cornwall, Scotland, and Germany, and then from Italy, Ireland, Eastern Europe, and Finland. And recent research is also uncovering incredible stories of people from China and African Americans escaping slavery and the Jim Crow South. The most thorough consideration of the social and technological history of the copper country is Larry Langton's book, Cradle to Grave, which I thoroughly recommend if you want to learn more about the mining in the region. And he wrote another one that brings the story up through the 1960s as well, called Hollowed Ground. And the copper country landscape was heavily shaped by systems of corporate paternalism common among industrial companies in the late 19th century. Once prospecting encouraged enough investment, companies would establish mining locations. They built housing first out of necessity to accommodate a workforce, and then to attract miners and their families to stay and build more substantial communities. And if you want to learn more about this part of the story, I recommend my friend Allison K. Hoagland's wonderful book, Mine Towns. In it, Hoagland demonstrates how the companies used the landscape and architecture to reinforce workplace hierarchy between skilled and unskilled workers, shift bosses, and managers. And over many years, they manipulated the size and opulence of the houses, the location of the many church denominations, and controlled access to amenities like libraries, bathhouses, and schools. And the building that was the Calumet and Hecla, or C&H Library in the upper right, is now part of the headquarters of the Keweenaw National Historical Park, which interprets the mining history of the region and supports dozens of locally owned and operated heritage sites and museums where you can come and visit and learn so much more about the people and places of the Keweenaw. And so in writing my book, I benefited from the park as well as the wonderful Michigan Tech archives, and you'll see that many of my photographs come from there, as well as the wonderful community of researchers and property owners, interpreters, and friends who shared resources and ideas with me over about the decade that I took writing this book. So I always want to acknowledge them. So in the book that resulted, I build on a lot of this previous work to consider what happened when the copper country frontier began to transform from mining locations into modern towns and cities. The mining companies up here did not run closed company towns of the sort you might know about from the Pennsylvania Coal District, where workers' pay was given in credit or scrip at the company store. Here, individual developers platted commercial towns, sold lots to entrepreneurs to run warehouses, stores, newspapers, hotels, and burgeoning other businesses. Places like Houghton, Hancock, and Red Jacket, the commercial town that's now called Calumet, grew so much that a good portion of the population did not work for the mining companies. So alongside the enormous industrial mining apparatus and the rows of identical company houses, there also developed commercial town centers, hotels, apartment buildings, and, as I demonstrate, elite neighborhoods much like the early suburbs developing in industrial cities all over the US. So suburbs are generally associated with the bourgeois desire to escape the busy and increasingly dangerous industrial workplace and bolster their residents' social status with the perceived wholesomeness and moral uplift of the countryside, sort of in the language of that period. But what happened when people constructed fashionable, picturesque houses, sort of like the ones you see here, far from the urban periphery for which they were designed? How did their anti-modern nostalgia and celebration of middle-class leisure fare when placed immediately adjacent to an active mine? And conversely, how did the pre-existing hierarchies of a company town change when its hoisting engines, mine shafts, and rows of worker housing were joined by the social hierarchies built into 19th century suburbs? So my book's title, Company Suburbs, suggests the intertwined nature of the paternalism of frontier company towns with the gender and class hierarchies of suburbanization. And so the stories I'm telling you tonight explore their effects on residents, women, and workers. So if we think of this as episode 1, the first episode in my story is in the city of Houghton, which was founded in 1859 by Ransom Sheldon and his brother-in-law, Columbus Christopher Douglas, as a commercial center to serve the many mining operations beginning to spring up. Town began to expand in the 1870s, spurred on by the financial success of some of its most prominent businessmen. And looking at this 1872 bird's eye, we see that to the east, or the left, a pretty rugged looking landscape. Well, this mine belonged to the Sheldon Columbian Mining Company, with investors on Wall Street and a local superintendent named John H. Forster. Their industrial apparatus included a mine shaft and steam hoist up on the hill, a tram line leading to a stamp mill on the Portage waterfront, which is just out of view of this image. And the line of houses to the east of the flagpole appeared as Office Row in company records. The company began shutting down after the Civil War when investors looked to recoup their costs. They recognized the potential of their location right next to Houghton's commercial town for real estate development. So even in the middle of this still rugged frontier, complete with wandering bull, which I'm sure you've all been wondering about, the company officers in Manhattan decided to plat large upscale lots on the far side or east of their stamp mill to market to Houghton's growing community of successful merchants and businessmen. Their neighborhood, called East Houghton, became the region's first company suburb. So John H. Forster kept a map like this in his office, in Office Row, and sold lots beginning in 1875, which he wrote to company officers he would sell only to the, quote, best sort, demonstrating their intention to create social hierarchy in the domestic landscape of the town. Following national trends among the upper middle class to begin to separate home from work as industrial workplaces began to get more gritty, more dangerous, and more stratified in terms of class, ethnicity, and race. The Portage Lake Mining Gazette ran a story in August of that year. It described an active scene of new construction. It said, the new town site, situated on the beautiful plateau east of Houghton, presents quite a busy scene. There are several buildings on course of construction. Mr. William Harr is erecting a neat cottage. Captain Meerman has a large building under roof. And Mr. Lord got his tasty residence last fall. Mr. Siller is erecting a square house with hip roof and observatory, which he expects to occupy sometime in October. Siller's house is no longer present, which is why I don't have a new picture of it. But as you can see, the other two houses from 1875 remain. So the article went on to describe the much larger houses that actually predated the Sheldon Columbian's new plat. It read, beyond the Sheldon Columbian proper, Mr. Graham Pope is found very comfortably situated in a large house on neat grounds. Farther on, we find, there's Mr. Pope, we find Mr. Chadbourne here, enjoying the pleasure of home in a beautiful and commodious residence. Mr. James Raymond and Mr. Van Orden have neat cottages nearly finished. And the Honorable J.A. Hubble is also preparing the ground for a handsome and costly residence to be commenced soon. J. Hubble had just been elected a representative in the US Congress and built himself an elaborate Italianate mansion, which he called the Highlands. He went on to state Congress and then became a circuit judge for Houghton County. In an 1883 history of the UP, his estate was featured in an engraved scene of picturesque domesticity, a great contrast to the mining landscape that surrounded it. The Highlands and its accompanying engraving signaled a real change in this region. The well-to-do families who were moving into East Houghton separated their homes from the businesses whose income supported them and associated themselves instead with the leisure and cultural capital their income could purchase. This architecture celebrates leisure and a degree of anti-modern nostalgia with its Italianate villas and square towers, rounded Romanesque arches and colonnades, and a permeable division between outside and inside. This architecture idealized the home as the moral refuge from the industrializing world, a trend that led directly later to suburbanization. So in this way, East Houghton, the region's first company suburb, became a fashionable boulevard for the financially successful and socially powerful, much like other grand boulevards in larger industrializing cities like Summit Avenue in St. Paul or Brush Park in Detroit. But the mining apparatus was never far away. Judge Hubble's carriage would have had to drive under the rumbling tram to get home from town. And even once the stamp mill and tram were disassembled around 1899, an adit remained opened and occasionally worked for the next 10 years. So J. Hubble after his death, I guess, his estate gave much of his land to the state of Michigan to create a home for Michigan's School of Mines, which eventually became Michigan Tech. And so, in fact, my office, where I'm sitting right now, is in the building right on the location where J. Hubbell's Grand Italian Estate once stood, which I often think of when I look at the parking lot outside my window. When the Sheldon Columbian, or the street that Sheldon Columbian platted as East Houghton's Main Street, came to be called College Avenue and became an elegant thoroughfare connecting Michigan Tech with town, lined with large old houses that are, many of which are now enjoyed by Greek and other student organizations in Houghton. So that was episode 1, our first company suburb. So episode 2 of our story takes us across the Portage Waterway to the town of Hancock and a specific neighborhood called East Hancock. So like East Houghton and Main Street, the lot sold by the Sheldon Columbian Mining Company, East Hancock was also platted and sold by a mining company, the Quincy Mining Company, which was among the region's most successful and long-lived operations. In this 1891 bird's eye, you can see several of their shaft rock houses and steam hoists working away at the top of the ridge. The land in this episode had been owned for several decades by the Quincy and was used for a tram to lower mined rock down to its mill. And you can see that rail kind of bisecting this detail picture that I have up. But in 1890, Quincy replaced its severely outdated stamp mill on the waterfront with new mills a few miles to the east. And as a result, the company found itself with empty land directly next to the downtown commercial district. In previous years, when the Quincy unloaded its copper poor land, it either built workers' houses or buildings for mining. But at this point, they did something else. They followed a trend that had been influencing other American cities for 20 years. They created an elite suburb. The area was officially known as the Quincy Addition. Over time, however, it came to be known as East Hancock, taking its name from an earlier addition farther to the east end of the bluff that had been sparsely settled in the 1880s. So once merged, this neighborhood separated its residents from both the commercial activity on Quincy Street and the industrial activity on the Portage Waterway. And while the Quincy Addition was barely 500 yards from the main shopping street, pedestrians still had to cross a deep ravine over a wooden bridge to get there. Even after the ravine was filled in to accommodate a modern street, the offset grid helped make East Hancock feel separate from the rest of town. Deed restrictions also excluded much of the working population. The Quincy Mining Company officials and their partners at the Northern Michigan Building and Loan Association, which they actually established especially to sell mortgages in this neighborhood, included a price minimum for the new houses. The phrase, quote, house not to be less than $2,000 appeared on every land contract, effectively ensuring a middle and upper middle class population in East Hancock. So over the next decade, Hancock's wealthy and powerful moved into East Hancock. By 1898, a boom began that the Copper Country Evening News called a new building era. New buyers ran warehouses and retail outlets. One of the Quincy Mining Company engineers moved in, also their accountant, and the widow of the captain who had run the old mill. And finally, in 1910, the mine superintendent and his son moved from a company-owned house into a new private mansion on East Hancock's bluff. So essentially, over the course of 15 years, the homes of the town's most powerful moved from being located either up on Quincy Hill or in the commercial district to being grouped together in a separate enclave, not terribly distant from the rest of town physically, but far removed from the experiences of working people in Hancock. I want to focus on one house in the Quincy Addition where we can get to know the people inside and how the landscapes of company paternalism and suburbanization, which we're getting all mixed together now, continued to shape daily life and relationships. So this is 209 Center Street, built for Edwin and Marie Henwood. Both of their families had been Cornish miners who came first to the lead mining region in southwestern Wisconsin and then to the copper country. Edwin, however, left behind his mining roots and instead pursued white-collar jobs and was a commission merchant by the time they moved to East Hancock in 1900. The Henwoods hired a local architect named Charles Archibald Pierce to build their house. He modeled it very closely on a nationally popular pattern book, design number 156 from Frank Allen's Artistic Dwellings, published in Grand Rapids. And when the 1900 census was taken, living with the Henwoods and their children was Tilly Heikkila, a 23-year-old Finnish woman listed as servant. She had come to Northern Michigan 4 years previously and did not speak English. Documentary research and context suggest that she probably came to the US at age 19, alone rather than with parents or family. While Finnish families had begun arriving in the copper country as early as the 1860s, Heikkila was among a major influx that occurred in the 1890s. As the most recent ethnic group to arrive in significant number, Finns occupied a lower rung on the social status in the copper country, behind the Irish, Italians, French Canadians, and Eastern Europeans who had already arrived to work for the mostly English, Scottish, and German professionals, many of whom were moving into East Hancock. The block on Franklin Street, indicated in blue here, was the heart of the growing Finnish community in Hancock. Cooperative boarding houses had been established starting in the 1880s to provide places for new immigrants to transition. Here, and in any of the so-called Finn halls, Heikkila would have found a strong Finnish community where her language, customs, values, and emotions would have been validated. As she walked from town into East Hancock, however, Heikkila would have experienced a sharp transition from being an individual within her national and ethnic community to being an outsider in East Hancock. She would have left Franklin Street, walked through the busy and very public commercial area on Quincy Street, but then in just this quick block, things would have changed for her. After crossing into East Hancock's differentiated street grid, she would have encountered walls, iron fences, and the families and friends of those she served. She transitioned from being a boarder in a boarding house or a friend to other immigrants to being a domestic worker directly and intimately controlled by some of the region's most powerful families. Once at the Henwoods' house, we have this great period photograph of the house. Heikkila saw the raised up front entrance with gracious porch, but a side entrance was designated for her and other service workers. You can see the little stairs from the sidewalk. This rare photo of the side walkway of the Henwoods' house, we can see that Heikkila would have walked along here, up a set of stairs to a covered porch in the back. She entered the kitchen and probably left her outdoor boots on the porch or just inside. From outdoors directly into her workplace, Heikkila's transition probably spelled some relief from the surveillance of the street and also from the cold most of the time. But once inside, she felt the burden of work. Throughout the house, she had essentially two areas between which she moved: the service column in gray and the more public family areas where she was still a servant, but under more surveillance. The rear of the Henwoods' house allowed Heikkila to use the rear stairs to access her bedroom, the bathroom, the attic, the linen closet, and laundry chute in the second floor hallway, as well as the basement laundry room and a basement toilet probably reserved for her, which has now been removed, but which survived until pretty recently in a lot of copper country houses. In general, Heikkila in the service column was doing her job and was, quote, in place, occupying the spaces designated for her by the architecture. When Heikkila passed out of the service zone into the family area, she passed through trigger points that required a subtle but important identity shift. She went from being a servant doing her work to being a servant in the public eye. While dusting or cleaning in the parlor or sitting room, for instance, she needed to heed Mrs. Henwood's instructions, muddling through with unfamiliar English words and customs. She knew that the mistakes in these spaces carried higher consequences than in the kitchen. One feature in in houses like this that has contributed to domestic workers' feelings of being outsiders seems to have been the swinging door that often separated the dining room from the kitchen. You see the Henwood's swinging door here. A funny story of a Finnish servant dropping a whole dish of noodles after being bonked by a swinging door was recorded in the late 1970s from a woman who had returned home to Finland after working in American homes. Similarly, in a local Copper Country oral history, a servant recalled one of her first days on the job in another upscale Copper Country neighborhood. She dropped a baked potato off a dish trying to get through a swinging door, but she decided to pick it up and replace it because, as she told herself, as she told people later on, at least it still had its skin on. It's like it still had a wrapper, so it was fine. Not surprisingly, a lot of later owners of people with these swinging doors tried a lot of different mechanisms to try to keep them from swinging, which is what you see in the bottom there. So for all its prescription, this modern house, which is what they were usually called in contemporary documents, modern houses, it did offer Heikkilä some spaces to escape surveillance and maybe even imagine new realities for herself, an opportunity that sociologists identify as important for challenging the status quo. This period photo captures a delivery carriage pulled around to the side door of a similar Copper Country house, meeting delivery men like this one at service entries several times a week. Domestic workers had the opportunity to talk, maybe flirt, and create relationships that stretched beyond the boundaries of elite East Hancock. A mechanical bell like this might have announced the arrival, not only of groceries, but of a friend with news from the Finnish community hall or family. Many houses had ice boxes where another frequent delivery would have been made, making yet another location where a domestic worker could have performed the wrong identity. And so in other words, she could have been for just a few minutes, not the Finnish servant girl, but rather the young woman back at the Finn Hall, not the worker the landscape and the house required her to be, but rather the person she was choosing to be. Conversations between live-in domestic workers and grocery or ice delivery men at the back doors might have been increasingly political in the 1910s as the entire Copper Country moved closer to the big strike, which finally broke out in July of 1913. The strike got national attention, and many of you know this if you've read The Women of the Copper Country. Scabs were brought in from around the country, and the National Guard camped out on mine grounds for 9 months until the workers' union was forced to give in. During this time, the shift in identity for a domestic worker who went from being a union supporter while talking at a basement door to maybe delivering washed linens upstairs must have been all the more noticeable, aggravating, and maybe even painful. So ultimately, I'm suggesting that conversations at back doors and service entrances created spaces for working class women to forge bonds within their own class and ethnic communities, even from within domestic environments created to enforce inferior status. Women had some space to instigate, motivate, and most importantly, to imagine change. So we're going to move to episode 3, our last episode. We move northward to the area around the Calumet and Hecla Company. I'll show you a map in a moment to help orient. So the house you see here is at the center of my last episode. Completed in 1908 in Laurium, this 13,000 square foot, it's very big, mansion was built for Thomas Hoatzin Jr., a longtime resident of the Copper Country who had just come into a large fortune. His father, Thomas Hoatzin Sr., was chief captain for Calumet and Hecla Mining Company, and the young Hoatzin grew up in the company's large captain's house, and by 1900 was living in manager's housing himself with his wife and 5 children. But soon after, he was able to retire from working and build a private mansion of his own because of a huge payout from successful mining ventures, not in Michigan, but far away in Arizona. And I want to be sure to note that this house today is one that you can visit. It's actually a bed and breakfast called the Laurium Manor Inn, run by a wonderful couple who have a couple of buildings in Laurium that you can stay in if you visit. Yeah. So Hotzen was one of several co-investors who also built large houses in Laurium between 1906 and 1908. These were primarily second-generation residents, sons of mining captains or successful merchants and professionals. And together in 1899, they funded a prospecting venture around Bisbee in southern Arizona, led by Thomas Hotzen's brother James, who'd been in the American West for some time. After a few rocky years securing funding, the company finally began to succeed in 1901. They renamed it the Calumet and Arizona Mining Company, aptly reflecting its geographical foci. And by 1903, the investors received their first dividends. By 1908, the CNA had paid out $7.5 million. And by 1913, it paid out more than $22 million. So with their windfall, several of the investors built mansions in Laurium that announced their financial superiority in no uncertain terms and reimagined their sense of place in the Copper Country. Compared to what existed in the town of Laurium before 1907, the CNA mansions were much larger and they were situated within the street grid differently. Laurium, which you see here in yellow, had been platted originally in 1878, again, by a mining company turning away from ore extraction and instead toward real estate. It was located close to the massive C&H industrial core, which is the sort of diagonal line in the middle of this map. Laurium offered a non-company owned housing and business opportunities for the ballooning population in the 1890s, which was outgrowing the commercial village of Red Jacket, which you see here in red. So 8 additions were made to the Laurium original town grid within a decade. The population grew by 400% in the 1890s. And by 1910, 8,500 people lived in Laurium. A commercial center existed on Hecla Street, but the majority of the town was single-family houses, mostly T and L plan, built by local builders with fashionable ornament. So as a result, Laurium looked like a standard middle-class community, but its population was in fact mixed in terms of income, living conditions, and ethnic background, as thousands of people arrived here from Eastern Europe, Italy, Finland, and elsewhere. And a significant number of these single-family houses contained boarders or extended family members, or went up as investment properties to take advantage of the mobile working population. Overall, the whole Calumet area, including Laurium, featured in close proximity both mining locations and commercial towns, company-built and independent housing, successful merchants and struggling working families, longtime residents as well as newcomers, and fashionable middle-class houses very close to crowded flats. So Thomas Hotzen's enormous house and the other CNA mansions further disrupted this already precarious mix of residence and architecture using scale and taste. Interestingly, the CNA investors did not choose to create a separate elite enclave, as had happened in East Houghton and in East Hancock and so many other early suburbs nationwide. I suggest that they couldn't do this because non-mineral lands available for building were so scarce here. Laurium's existing street grid was their only option. So without physical distance or legal barriers at their disposal, the CNA investors instead differentiated themselves using new nationally fashionable tastes not seen in the Copper Country before. They bought whichever contiguous lots they could find in Laurium to accommodate the enormous houses with carriage houses that they planned to build. We know that at least 4 of the 5 CNA investors hired the same architect. Charles Moss had worked for the C&H Mining Company for years already around Calumet, but most of his buildings, whether in Calumet or elsewhere, had been variations on these 2.5-story gable front side hall with decorative Palladian window in the gable. Working for Hotzen, however, Moss built something very different. He seems to have turned to a pattern book sort of like Pierce did for the Henwoods. The exterior form and interior plans of Hoatson's house closely resemble design number 1 in George F. Barber's Modern Dwellings, a pattern book with wide national distribution, the 3rd edition of which was published in 1901 that you see here. Both Barber's design and Hoatson's house featured a large square footprint with 2-story columned portico, hipped roof with balustrade, gracious full-width porch, flanking side wings and porte cocheres, tall side chimneys, and assorted dormer windows. Inside, Hoatson's floor plans differ somewhat from Barber's design, but both include a central hallway flanked by the same basic elements: a sitting room, a parlor, a music room, library, and both stairs lead to an airy 2nd floor hall with 6 bedrooms. Hoatson's house contains all the same elements as Barber's design, but in a different configuration. The kitchen is equipped with an elaborate ice box with delivery hatch, breakfast room, hall, pantry, and back stairs to the 3rd floor service rooms. So this is a prime example of a house type that architectural historian Richard Guy Wilson has half-jokingly termed columnitis giganticus. Neoclassical and colonial revival behemoths like this gained popularity after being used for both the Connecticut and Kentucky state houses at the 1893 Chicago Columbian Exposition. And indeed, Hoatson's house owed a debt to McKim, Mead, and White's White City, and that firm's brand of American Renaissance architecture, which assumed the mantle of Greco-Roman traditions for the maturing United States. On the inside, Hoatson's furnishings shed most classical and American colonial references in favor instead of heavy European historicism and modernist abstractions. And for these, Hoatson hired Maxwell, Forbes, and Stillman, decorators and furnishers from Milwaukee, which had been working for that city's industrialist leaders and had designed the famous Schlitz Palm Garden, which you see here. So an 11-page bill from Hoatson's house survives, totaling $33,278 for an incredibly rich array of architectural ornament that connected the Hoatsons to European precedent and aristocratic legacy. The living room had Louis XIII damask curtains, and the parlor had mahogany furniture covered in Hepplewhite damask velvet. 3 pairs of Italian tapestry portieres would have stretched across the doorways in the lower hall. And Hoatson may have asserted his own heritage by requesting that thistles, the national flower of his parents' native Scotland, be featured in the intricate tile mosaic fireplace surrounding the den, as you see here. But modern taste for the exotic and abstract also figured prominently. In the dining room, elephant hide wall covering was tooled and painted in subdued colors and gold accents. Custom-made matching lighting fixtures originally appeared but are now gone. Abstracted interlacing tendrils and warm colors grace the plaster cove molding in the formal entrance gallery and recall Louis Sullivan, Frank Lloyd Wright, and Purcell and Elmsley designs popular throughout the upper Midwest in this period. But interestingly, the Hoatsons did in some places also celebrate the local landscape. Another boy's bedroom featured quintessentially North Woods scenes of deer with pine and birch trees, and the den on the 1st floor features green landscape scenes said to be the view around the family's summer camp house about 30 miles north. So overall, the Hoatsons' evocation of historical European design and simultaneous embrace of modernist abstraction effectively linked them to America's burgeoning aristocracy. Historian Sven Beckert has argued that New York's industrialists were designing their worlds to match their political and ideological turns since the Civil War. In their minds, modern corporations could no longer support a Jacksonian democracy that empowered individual workers. They required more autonomy. In response, industrialists donned the architectural clothing of powerful historical rulers, but flavored it with an American character forged in the great American outdoors. So following this popular trend, the Hoatson house offered family and guests a refuge from the modern industrial world, more in conversation with national bourgeois fantasies than with local realities. So how did the Hoatzins' expressions of bourgeois social status affect everyone else? Well, I argue that this new house effectively thrust the issue of class identity onto the streets of Laurium. Some people might have felt pride in Laurium's rapid growth and the success of its prominent residents, an attitude amply demonstrated in local newspaper coverage. A middle-class resident might stand up straighter or brush dust from her hat in order to appear as respectable as possible in case she ever received an invitation to enter. A working class person might do the same, especially someone who may have had a good experience working for Thomas Hoatzin or his father. But a worker with a different experience might have instead felt frustrated, ashamed, prescribed, or pigeonholed. He might have felt differently on different days, or as years progressed and workplace tensions increased. Oh, more pictures of the houses. Interestingly, Hoatzin and the CNA investors well understood that houses have the power to trigger identity consciousness and define social relationships. Because in the same years that they were building mansions in Laurium, they were also using houses in Arizona to manipulate the CNA workforce. CNA company leaders, including both James and Thomas Hoatzin and their brother-in-law, tried to subdue racial strife in labor organization around their Arizona company by selling new modern bungalows to workers. Ultimately, it did not stave off the class and ethnic strife that eventually led to the 1917 forced exodus of almost 2,000 workers considered foreign troublemakers, as they said at the time. That event is known today as the Bisbee deportation. To here. So to close, thinking about aesthetics and taste and how people move through the landscape, we can begin to understand the role of many players in addition to the local manager and worker groups whose actions in the year leading up to the 1913-14 strike contributed to the rupturing social fabric. And likewise, we can begin to understand the role that domestic landscapes played in what seem like workplace struggles. So Hoatzin's house brought nationally popular bourgeois tastes to the Copper Country and helped the upper middle class residents see themselves as belonging to a reimagined bourgeois place and others as outsiders. But at the same time, it allowed workers to accuse the Hoatzins and other elites of being no longer connected to the realities of mining here and as outsiders in their own homes. I'm going to shift my gears for a moment and just finish up with a slide and a website to let you know about a project that I've been working on for a number of years called the Keweenaw Time Traveler, which is an online interactive historical atlas for Michigan's Copper Country. And we are relaunching this spring. So I'm going to be sure to send some information down to Monroe because this is a resource that you all can access in order to learn more about the people and the changing built environment, buildings, and city organization in this region from where you are, or entice you to come visit. This is a historical online atlas that uses historical maps to tie places to historical data sets. So it includes maps from all of these wonderful archives that have been digitized and kind of layered on top of each other in space. And we've been working on connecting historical data sets like city directories and census records, and are working on other kinds of records from schools and from actually the CNH mining company. And we've been redesigning it to make all of this information more accessible and user-friendly, essentially. So it will look like this in early June. We've been working with some wonderful designers here in Houghton, so that you can explore historical maps with footprints of actual buildings and learn about who lived there when. So this is actually the Henwood's house from the 1920 census. So I will be sure to send a little more information down to Monroe, but in the meantime, the website's in here. Can find it at keweenawhistory.com. if you'd like to explore it in the meantime. But for now, I will say thank you. I really appreciate everyone coming, and I'm really interested in feedback and questions. Thanks so much.
What an excellent and stimulating presentation. That was so insightful, man. What an amazing backdrop to help understand and contextualize and fill out something like the Women of the Copper Country. This is amazing research you've been doing, and it's very inspiring too. I'll start off with one question. Do you have any preference? Do you have any, if anybody wants to buy the book, your book, where can they get it?
Oh, it's, I guess the best place to go is the University of Tennessee Press website, which is just utpress. .org, yeah, utpress.org, but it's available, any of the online places where you buy books. It's on Amazon. And up here in the Copper Country, some of our local bookstores are starting to carry it. I know it, there are shipping problems, and I know some people who've tried to order it, they're waiting a little bit to get it. Everything's a little slow, but I'm hoping that local bookstores will have it too, because that's always the best place to buy books. But